They were freezing, starving, and marching straight into a storm that could kill them faster than any musket. By sunrise, Washington's army was supposed to be shattered by exhaustion, swallowed by the Delaware River, or simply too numb to lift their weapons. Instead, these half-broken men were about to throw themselves into an attack so reckless that even success would look like a miracle. Because Washington wasn't leading an army anymore. He was dragging a revolution on life support. And the plan he carried that night contained a fatal flaw, one that could destroy them before they ever reached Trenton. But hidden inside that flaw was the only path to survival they had left. A week earlier, everything was already collapsing. The British thought the war was over. The Hessians believed the rebels were beaten, and Washington's own men, many of them were waiting for their enlistments to expire so they could go home before they starved or froze to death. Supplies were gone. Morale was a ghost. Continental officers were begging men to stay in the ranks, and some units simply vanished in the night. The army that remained barely resembled a fighting force. Yet this broken army was marching toward an enemy twice as well equipped, better fed, and fully confident that the Americans couldn't strike in winter. The terrain added insult to injury. The Delaware River was half frozen, clogged with chunks of ice sharp enough to tear hulls apart. Winter winds cut through layers of wool like knives. Horses panicked at the sound of cracking ice. The march itself felt like a punishment, but none of that mattered. Washington knew the truth. If they didn't attack now, the rebellion would bleed out in silence. The first phase began in darkness. Boats pushed into the river, grinding against floating ice sheets. Soldiers slipped and slammed against the planks. Some nearly vanished into the black water, dragged out only seconds before hypothermia could finish them. Artillery had to be lashed down, with ropes thick as wrists, to keep cannons from sliding overboard. Every splintered oar and every delay tightened the window. Washington needed all 3 divisions across before dawn, but dawn was coming faster than his men could move. Still, they crossed. Somehow. When they reached the Jersey shore, the storm turned vicious. Sleet hammered down, soaking powder horns and freezing coats into stiff boards. Horses snorted clouds of steam as the wind ripped across the shoreline. Officers could barely shout orders over the gale. The plan was already breaking apart. Instead of hitting Trenton before daylight, they would now strike late, in full view of the enemy. And then came another crisis. Men began collapsing onto the snow, legs twitching, bodies shaking uncontrollably. Washington rode beside them, urging them up, refusing to stop. He knew momentum was the only thing keeping the army alive. As they marched, the storm delivered an unexpected gift: cover. The blinding sleet made the landscape vanish, turning roads into white rivers and muffling every footstep. Hessian pickets saw nothing but swirling snow. The Americans were ghosts moving through a frozen world. But the Hessians weren't blind forever. The second phase erupted when distant sentries spotted silhouettes emerging from the storm. At first, they assumed it was a small raiding party. The Hessians were used to that. American militias had been harassing them for weeks, and always ran when challenged. They had no reason to expect a full assault. Most believed the Americans had neither the discipline nor the strength to coordinate anything major. They were wrong. The Americans crashed into Trenton from 2 directions, arriving with far more precision than any starving, frost-bitten army should have been capable of. Washington had divided his force into columns, each tasked with collapsing the town like a set of closing jaws. Sleet turned the attack into a blurred nightmare. Hessian officers shouted in German, drums tried to beat formations into existence, and Washington's men fired down the icy streets with growing confidence. American artillery, dragged over frozen roads at impossible cost, roared to life. Cannons fired into intersections, blasting apart any attempt at organization. Every shot kicked up smoke and splinters of frozen debris, trapping Hessian units in a maze of choking fog and ricocheting iron. The third phase unfolded as Washington tightened the net. Continental infantry swept through the outer edges, clearing houses and barns one by one. Soldiers battered down doors, forcing Hessians out with bayonets. Washington himself rode toward the sound of the heaviest gunfire, directing units into positions that cut off every escape route. Farther south, Sullivan's division sealed the bridge over the Assunpink Creek, preventing any breakout. Inside the town, Hessian commander Johann Rall faced a nightmare of collapsed communication. Messages arrived late or never. Storm noise drowned out commands. Officers led small pockets of men into counterattacks, only to find their flanks collapsing before they even reached musket range. They weren't fighting one enemy. They were fighting a town that had turned hostile. The fourth phase ignited when Rall tried to rally his forces in the center of Trenton. He believed that if he could form a concentrated line, he might punch through the Americans and escape. But the Americans had anticipated it. Washington had already placed artillery to dominate the crossroads. When Rall's men advanced, a devastating barrage tore through the ranks. Horses shrieked, officers fell, drums went silent. Momentum died in an instant. This was the underdog pivot, the moment when the superior force realized they weren't fighting a mob. They were fighting an army with intent. For the first time, panic touched the Hessian ranks. The fifth phase brought the final collapse. Smoke thickened until the streets looked like tunnels. Soldiers fired at shadows. Others charged blindly, slipping on ice, crashing into wooden fences, breaking formations apart. Hessian units tried to regroup, but every direction led to American fire. Some stumbled into alleys only yards from cannon barrels. Others found roads blocked by bayonet lines or overturned wagons. The entire town felt like it was closing in. Washington moved through the storm with measured control. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His presence alone steadied men who had been trembling only hours before. He understood something the Hessians didn't. The chaos wasn't a liability. It was his weapon. Confusion favored the desperate. The final engagement detonated when Rall attempted one last breakout. He rode to rally his men, sword raised, calling them forward. But as he turned toward the American lines, a volley ripped through the storm. Rall slumped in the saddle. His men watched him fall, and the fight drained out of them. Smoke thinned just enough for officers to see the truth. They were surrounded. Ammunition was low. Their commander was bleeding out, and every street they tried to escape through was already in American hands. Would you have ordered one more charge, knowing it meant annihilation, or surrendered to save what remained? Silence soon drowned the gunfire. Hessians laid down their weapons. Over 900 surrendered. Flags lowered slowly, then dropped into the snow. The Americans stood in stunned disbelief. They had expected a bloody struggle. Instead, they had taken an elite garrison with shocking speed. But the victory carried a brutal cost. Many Americans collapsed where they stood, overwhelmed by fatigue and cold. Some soldiers lost fingers or toes to frostbite. Others suffered months-long injuries from hauling artillery through the storm. The weather had wounded almost as many men as the enemy. Still, what came next mattered more than the town itself. The consequences rippled across the colonies. Enlistments, once evaporating, suddenly surged. New recruits, hearing whispers of the impossible victory, came forward. The British were forced to confront a terrifying realization. The Americans were not beaten. In fact, they were evolving. Washington had shown that discipline, timing, terrain, and sheer audacity could overturn every advantage the enemy held. Trenton became a turning point not because it ended the war, but because it resurrected its spirit. It shattered the myth of Hessian invincibility. It proved the Continental Army could strike with precision, and it forced the British to rethink how they fought a rebellion that refused to die quietly. They won the town, but what they truly won back was the belief that this war could still be theirs, and belief, in a winter like that, was the deadliest weapon on the continent. But the victory wasn't secure yet. Even with Trenton taken, Washington knew the British response would be swift and merciless. Armies didn't lose elite garrisons without demanding retribution, and the British High Command would never allow Washington to escape across the river untouched. The battle was won, but the clock was already ticking toward the next disaster. News traveled fast. Hessian couriers, terrified and half-frozen, raced through the countryside with fragments of the truth. Word reached British posts by midday, igniting disbelief, then fury. To them, this wasn't just a defeat. It was an insult. Washington hadn't simply attacked. He had humiliated them, and humiliation in war is a spark that always searches for something to burn. Washington understood this perfectly. So the next phase of strategy unfolded the moment the guns fell silent. Officers scrambled through Trenton streets, gathering prisoners, securing weapons, and sorting wounded from dead. American soldiers who had marched through hell now had to move with surgical precision. Every minute lost tightened the trap the British would soon spring. Meanwhile, Washington walked through the captured town with eyes that refused to slow down. He noted every alley, every fence line, every angle a British column might use if they arrived sooner than expected. His brain never stopped computing the next threat. He understood the battlefield the way a drowning man understands air, with instinct, urgency, and absolute need. Yet even in victory, a new problem surged toward him. His men wanted to leave. Most enlistments were expiring in less than a week. Many soldiers had already packed their few belongings. They had believed they would die before reaching Trenton. Now that they had lived, their instinct was to go home while they still could. Washington saw it happening in their eyes, the subtle shift from desperation to relief. Relief was dangerous. Relief made armies disappear. So Washington gathered those men. He didn't shout. He didn't command. He appealed to something deeper than orders. He told them that the revolution would collapse without them, that their victory meant nothing if they abandoned the field now. He offered a bounty. He offered gratitude. But most importantly, he offered belief. Belief in what they had just proven about themselves. Some men stepped forward without hesitation. Others stood still, torn between fear and purpose. A few turned away and walked off into the cold, choosing safety over history. But many stayed, enough to keep the army alive, enough to prepare for the next move, because Washington wasn't done. He knew the British wouldn't simply retake Trenton. They would come in overwhelming numbers, sweeping through New Jersey with the fury of a wounded empire. His army couldn't withstand a direct confrontation. Not yet. They had to move. They had to reposition. They had to turn one miracle into momentum. And momentum in war is a rare currency. The next phase began as Washington prepared his men to recross the Delaware. It was a gamble even riskier than the first crossing. The river was now colder, heavier with ice, and churned by the storm that had concealed their attack. If even one artillery piece sank, the army would lose its teeth. If too many soldiers froze, the army would lose its heart. But Washington forced the retreat anyway. He knew staying in Trenton meant annihilation. All through the night, men hauled captured supplies onto boats. Prisoners were escorted across the river under heavy guard. Officers snapped orders with a sharpness that cut through fatigue. Soldiers who had fought fiercely hours before now staggered through snowdrifts, carrying cannon wheels, barrels of powder, and whatever blankets they could salvage. Victory hadn't warmed them. Reality hadn't spared them. And all the while, British scouts crept closer. Some small engagements flared in the woods, quick flashes of musket fire, silhouettes darting between trees, riders galloping through the storm with warnings. Each exchange reminded Washington that time was evaporating. But still, somehow, he completed the withdrawal. When the Continental Army reached the Pennsylvania shore again, half dead from exhaustion, the enormity of what they'd done began to settle. They had crossed an impossible river twice, fought a professional enemy head-on, and reshaped the entire winter campaign. But war never rewards rest, and Washington had already started planning his next strike, the one that would transform Trenton from a miracle into a turning point. Because the British weren't retreating, they were mobilizing. Columns assembled, dragoons prepared to ride down any rebel stragglers. Supplies were requisitioned. Orders thundered across command posts. Every officer understood the mission: crush Washington before he could escape again. The British believed the Americans would run. Washington planned to attack again. The next phase of the war was about to ignite. He moved his army once more, not back into Pennsylvania, but back toward New Jersey, back toward the enemy, back into danger. Because he knew the psychological cost of retreat. He couldn't let the British reclaim the initiative, not after what his men had just bled for. And so began the campaign that would lead to Princeton. The shock waves of Trenton rippled across the colonies. Men who had lost faith found it again. Civilians who had hidden from the war now believed it might actually be winnable. Loyalists questioned their certainty. British officers questioned their assumptions, and Hessian troops, once feared across the continent, now carried the memory of a defeat they couldn't explain. Trenton became more than a battle. It became a message, a cold warning sent through winter wind. This rebellion wasn't dying. It was evolving, and it would not die quietly. History celebrates the victory. It rarely remembers how close it came to freezing to death.